The sound of markets trembling doesn't always come from Wall Street. Sometimes it begins in places the world once ignored. Picture this: more than 10 African nations, from Ghana to Uganda, from Niger to Zimbabwe, standing up and saying no more. No more selling gold, uranium, cocoa, coffee, or timber at bargain prices while foreign companies walk away with fortunes. No more watching their own people struggle while the wealth beneath their soil fuels someone else's prosperity. For decades, Western capitals operated under a quiet assumption Africa would remain the warehouse of raw materials, cheap and endless. Oil for engines, cobalt for smartphones, lithium for electric cars, cocoa for chocolate. The modern world was built on African soil, yet Africa was always kept at the bottom of the chain. But now that chain is breaking, and the shockwaves are reaching Paris, London, Brussels, and Washington. This time it's not Africa on the defensive, it's the West scrambling to adjust. Ghana has told foreign miners sell 20% of refined gold directly to our central bank. Uganda has declared no more raw coffee beans leaving our ports without local processing. Niger has restricted uranium exports, leaving France's nuclear lifeline in jeopardy. Each move is bold. Each one reshapes the rules. Together they form something far bigger, a continental awakening. And here is the question for all of us watching: is this the dawn of Africa's sovereignty? Are we witnessing the moment when African nations stop playing by someone else's script and finally write their own brothers and sisters? This story is not about economics alone. It is about dignity, justice, and power. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré and leaders like him are shifting the balance of history, then you know this is more than news. It is destiny unfolding before our eyes. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to witness Africa's rise. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. When the first domino fell, it was Ghana that pushed it forward. For years, Ghana stood as one of Africa's top gold producers, yet its economy often swayed like a fragile branch in the winds of global finance. Gold would leave the country in raw form, shipped off at bargain prices to foreign refineries, while Ghana's central bank scrambled for stability by depending on the dollar or euro. The irony was cruel. A nation rich in gold was constantly poor in reserves, left exposed to every shockwave from Wall Street or Brussels. In 2023, that changed. The Ghanaian government announced a groundbreaking policy: all mining companies would be required to sell 20% of their refined gold directly to the central bank. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated strike at a global system that had long treated African resources as cheap inputs for foreign wealth. By insisting on refined gold, not raw or Ghana, forced part of the value chain to remain on its own soil. Jobs in refining and related industries began to grow. The central bank's reserves strengthened. And perhaps most importantly, Ghana began to free itself from the grip of foreign currencies. Imagine the impact. For the first time in decades, Ghana wasn't watching helplessly as its gold left in crates and bars, only to return in the form of financial dependence. Instead, its leaders redirected the flow, ensuring that the nation itself held a greater share of the wealth extracted from its own ground. This move carried a simple but profound message. Why should a country rich in gold need to kneel before foreign currencies to survive? Not long after, Uganda followed suit, but with a different resource and a different kind of boldness. In 2021, Uganda shocked the world by banning the export of raw agricultural products, including its globally renowned coffee and tea. Uganda ranks among the world's top coffee producers, yet farmers there had long endured poverty while international corporations pocketed the lion's share of profits. Multinational coffee brands built empires on beans harvested in Ugandan soil, roasted and packaged in Europe or America, and then sold back to the world at inflated prices. The farmers remained underpaid. The cycle seemed unbreakable. But Uganda broke it. The government declared that no raw coffee beans would leave the country without first being roasted, packaged, and branded at home. The shift was seismic. Suddenly, international coffee giants were faced with two options: invest in Uganda's local processing facilities, paying Ugandan workers fairer wages, or search desperately for other sources. Either way, the balance of power had changed. The effects rippled quickly. New factories emerged on Ugandan soil. Packaging plants opened their doors. Local entrepreneurs seized the chance to build their own coffee brands, competing not just as suppliers, but as producers with global ambition. For the Ugandan farmer, the change wasn't abstract. It meant better prices, more local jobs, and a new sense of dignity. Instead of watching their harvests leave in burlap sacks, they now saw finished products bags of roasted coffee ready for international shelves emerging from their own communities. Taken together, the actions of Ghana and Uganda marked a turning point. These were not isolated experiments. They were a call to the rest of Africa. The continent no longer had to remain the silent engine of global prosperity while its own people stayed in the shadows. By keeping value at home, whether in refined gold or roasted coffee, African nations proved that sovereignty wasn't just about borders or speeches. It was about reshaping the very flow of wealth. And Western markets noticed. Gold traders in London saw tighter margins. Coffee companies in Europe scrambled to adjust their supply chains. Investors began to whisper about risk in Africa, not because of instability, but because Africa was finally stabilizing itself on its own terms. This was the heart of the story, the first wave of African nations refusing to play the old game. Ghana and Uganda didn't simply regulate exports. They redefined what it meant to be sovereign in the 21st century. Their message to the world was clear: Africa's wealth will no longer flow outward without first nourishing its own people. And as other nations watched, the question spread like wildfire across the continent: if Ghana can do this with gold, if Uganda can do it with coffee, then why not us? If Ghana and Uganda lit the spark, it was Gabon and Niger that turned the flame into a firestorm. Their decisions struck at the very heart of Europe's industries and energy security, sending shockwaves far beyond Africa's borders. Let's begin with Gabon. Back in 2010, Gabon's government made a move that seemed modest. At first, it banned the export of raw logs. For decades, European companies had shipped vast quantities of Gabonese timber, turning it into luxury furniture, flooring, and high-end products abroad. Gabon was left with stripped forests, low-paying jobs, and a thin share of the profits. But when the ban took effect, the narrative changed. Suddenly, if Europe wanted wood, it had to buy finished products from Gabonese factories. Carpentry workshops and furniture plants multiplied in Libreville and beyond. Young Gabonese found work not just as loggers, but as craftsmen, engineers, and entrepreneurs. For the first time, the nation's forests were fueling its own economy instead of feeding someone else's wealth. Then came Niger, a move that rattled the very foundations of France. Nearly 70% of France's electricity comes from nuclear power, and that nuclear power depends on uranium mined in Niger. For decades, Niger's uranium was sold at bargain prices while France lit up its cities and powered its industries. Niger, meanwhile, remained among the world's poorest nations. But in the wake of political shifts in 2023, Niger's leaders imposed strict limits on uranium exports. The message was blunt: no more giveaways. This was the turning point. Paris, once confident in its unshakable supply chain, suddenly faced the possibility of blackouts, higher costs, and dependence on a nation it had long treated as a junior partner. The symbolism was undeniable. A country often dismissed as powerless had its hand on the switch that kept France's lights on. For many across Africa, this was the ultimate reversal of roles. No longer was Niger a silent supplier. It was now the gatekeeper of one of Europe's most vital resources. As if that weren't enough, Guinea added another layer to the storm. Long known for its fertile land and abundant harvests, Guinea had seen its rice maize and yams shipped abroad, while its own citizens struggled with food shortages and rising prices. The contradiction was painful. Guinean families paid dearly for food while their fields fed foreign markets. In a decisive moment, the government banned exports of staple crops. Unlike the moves in gold, coffee, or uranium, this wasn't about securing foreign currency or striking global industries. It was about feeding its own people first. The response was immediate. Importers who had grown used to cheap Guinean staples scrambled to secure other sources, driving up costs on international markets. But inside Guinea, the message resonated deeply. Parents could put food on the table without fearing that the best of their harvest had sailed overseas. It wasn't just policy, it was a declaration of dignity. For the first time in decades, Guineans could feel that their government was putting citizens ahead of profit. The combined effect of these moves sent shockwaves across the world. Western media framed it as a crisis: rising costs, disrupted supply chains, and risks to global markets. But within Africa, the narrative was entirely different. From Accra to Kampala, from Niamey to Conakry, people saw something larger than economics. They saw a continent finally pushing back against centuries of extraction. They saw leaders willing to take the political risk of standing up to the old order. And the emotional high point came in Niger. To many Africans, the idea that a single landlocked country could bring France's nuclear industry to its knees felt like poetic justice. It was the David and Goliath story rewritten for the modern age. For the West, it was a nightmare of dependency revealed in plain sight. For Africa, it was proof that leverage had always been there, it simply needed leaders bold enough to use it. This was the climax of the new resource sovereignty movement, African nations no longer asking politely but setting terms. And the world, for the first time in living memory, had no choice but to listen. As the policies spread, the ripple effects across African societies became impossible to ignore. What began as export restrictions quickly evolved into something much deeper, a reshaping of daily life politics and national identity. Take Mozambique. For years, its forests were stripped bare with raw logs shipped overseas at bargain prices. Local communities saw little benefit beyond grueling labor and shrinking woodlands. When the government banned raw log exports in 2017, the consequences were dramatic. New sawmills, carpentry workshops, and plywood factories opened their doors. Thousands of Mozambicans found jobs not as low-wage loggers, but as skilled workers in processing plants. Families who once watched wealth vanish now saw it circulate through their own neighborhoods. The policy didn't just create jobs, it sparked pride. Citizens could point to finished products stamped "Made in Mozambique" and know that their forests were building their own economy. Namibia added another layer to this transformation: lithium. The lifeblood of electric cars and clean energy was once extracted from its soil and exported raw. International companies treated Namibia as a convenient pit stop in their global supply chains. That changed when the government imposed restrictions on raw lithium exports. If automakers and tech companies wanted access, they would have to invest in Namibia itself, building refineries, processing plants, and jobs. The civil effect was immediate. Young Namibians saw opportunities emerging in industries tied not to extraction alone, but to technology and innovation. Politically, the move signaled a new confidence. Namibia wasn't begging for investment, it was demanding partnership on equal terms. Then there was Ivory Coast, home to the richest cocoa fields in the world. For generations, Ivorian farmers toiled while foreign chocolate giants turned their beans into billion-dollar fortunes abroad. The government's new restrictions on raw cocoa exports changed that narrative overnight. Local processing facilities began to multiply. Farmers saw better prices, workers found employment in chocolate factories, and entire communities began to imagine a future where Ivory Coast wasn't just the supplier of raw beans, but a global leader in finished chocolate. These shifts carried profound political consequences. In each country, leaders who championed resource sovereignty saw their legitimacy rise. Citizens recognized that their governments were not merely administrators of poverty, but defenders of national wealth. Policies that once seemed like abstract economic reforms now touched the dinner table, the job market, and the pride of ordinary people. Food security in Guinea, stable energy in Niger, stronger reserves in Ghana, and new industries in Mozambique and Ivory Coast, all of it spoke directly to the everyday lives of African citizens. But the changes also came with challenges. Western corporations lobbied hard against the restrictions. Diplomatic pressure mounted. Some African elites tied to old systems of profit sharing with foreign companies resisted the reforms. Yet the political momentum was clear. A generation of younger Africans rallied behind leaders who spoke the language of sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, with his fiery speeches about independence and dignity, became a symbol of this continental awakening. Even in countries not yet adopting such policies, citizens began to ask, why not us? The civil impact was as much psychological as it was material. For the first time in living memory, millions of Africans felt that the wealth of their land was being defended in their name. Pride replaced resignation. Hope replaced despair. And in the political sphere, leaders discovered a powerful new source of legitimacy, not from foreign approval, but from their own people. The message was clear. Africa's resources were no longer just commodities. They had become instruments of justice, catalysts of dignity, and foundations for political renewal. From Washington to Brussels, the moves by African nations have not gone unnoticed. What began as local economic policies quickly transformed into a geopolitical reckoning. For the first time in decades, Western powers found themselves confronting a reality they had long dismissed. Africa held the leverage. Consider the Democratic Republic of the Congo. With some of the world's largest reserves of cobalt and copper, the very minerals that power electric cars, smartphones, and solar grids, the DRC had long been treated as a raw supplier. But when Kinshasa restricted the export of unprocessed cobalt and copper, the consequences stretched across the globe. Tech giants in California, from Silicon Valley to Seattle, suddenly realized their green future was tied to decisions made in the heart of Africa. Companies that had taken cheap cobalt for granted were now forced to negotiate on new terms, invest in Congolese infrastructure, or face shortages that could derail production. For Washington, it was a strategic alarm. The road to clean energy independence ran through Africa, not just domestic policy. Zimbabwe echoed this message with chrome. For decades, raw chrome ore fed the steel mills of Europe and Asia. But with new bans on raw exports, Zimbabwe shifted the balance. Smelting and processing began to expand locally, creating industries that had once seemed impossible. Western firms, long accustomed to cheap access, suddenly faced higher costs. For global markets, it was a disruption. For Zimbabwe, it was a reclamation of dignity. And for observers in the U.S., it was another reminder Africa was no longer a passive participant in the supply chain, it was shaping the chain itself. The political implications ran deeper. In Europe, governments faced uncomfortable questions about their dependence on African resources. France's reliance on Niger's uranium laid bare just how fragile its energy system was without African cooperation. Germany, hungry for lithium and cobalt to meet its electric vehicle targets, had to reconsider its partnerships. Even Britain, with its post-Brexit ambitions of global trade, saw its leverage shrink as African nations demanded more equitable terms. In Washington, policymakers debated how to respond. Some urged a return to Cold War-style influence campaigns, fearing that Africa's new assertiveness would push nations closer to Russia or China. Others argued that the U.S. must finally treat Africa as a true partner, investing in local industries, respecting sovereignty, and building relationships that went beyond resource extraction. For many in the American public, especially older generations who remember the rhetoric of foreign aid, this shift felt like an awakening. Africa didn't need aid, it needed respect. Global corporations, too, were forced to adapt. Coffee giants in Europe, chocolate companies in Switzerland, tech firms in the US, and automakers in Asia all were confronted with the same reality. The days of bargain prices and one-sided deals were ending. If they wanted Africa's resources, they would have to pay fairly, invest locally, and share value more equitably. And yet, amid the frustration, there was also recognition. Analysts in New York and London admitted that Africa's stance might actually stabilize global markets in the long run. By developing stronger local industries, African nations could become more reliable partners, less vulnerable to crises and currency shocks. In that sense, Africa's sovereignty push wasn't only a challenge to the West, it was also an opportunity if only the West was willing to see it. This was the global picture: America and Europe confronted with their own dependency, Asia watching closely, and Africa stepping into a role that could no longer be denied. The world's balance of power was shifting, and it was happening not in conference rooms in Washington or Brussels, but in the gold mines of Ghana, the cocoa fields of Ivory Coast, and the uranium pits of Niger. Step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. What we are witnessing is not just a handful of trade policies, it is the birth of a new era. From gold in Ghana to uranium in Niger, from cocoa in Ivory Coast to cobalt in the Congo, Africa's message is consistent. Our resources will no longer leave our soil without building our future first. For centuries, the wealth of this continent fueled other nations' prosperity, while Africans endured poverty, instability, and dependence. That cycle is breaking before our eyes. But history reminds us every power shift invites resistance. Western corporations and governments will not give up their advantages easily. Already we see lobbying, diplomatic pressure, and media campaigns painting these moves as threats to global markets. The real threat, however, is not Africa's rise, it is the stubborn refusal of old powers to accept a fairer world. If the West cannot adapt, if it clings to one-sided deals, the tensions we see today may grow into crises tomorrow. For African nations, the path forward is both hopeful and dangerous. Building local industries is not easy. It requires infrastructure, skilled labor, and strong governance. Corruption, mismanagement, or political instability could still undermine the vision. Yet the determination is there, and the people are watching closely. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has become a symbol of this continental shift, young, defiant, and unafraid to challenge a global system stacked against his people. His call for sovereignty echoes far beyond Ouagadougou, resonating with citizens across the continent, and even among the diaspora. And so the question falls to us, will Africa succeed in turning its natural wealth into true independence? Will leaders like Traoré, standing at the crossroads of history, manage to hold the line against immense external pressure? Or will new obstacles force compromises that dilute this moment of power? Brothers and sisters, this is where your voice matters. If you believe that Africa's future should be written by Africans, then you are part of this story. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies carry the seeds of real change, then now is the time to stand behind them, or to ask the hard questions. Can we continue to trust his leadership, or should Africa prepare for another to carry the torch? Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to understand and support President Ibrahim Traoré's vision. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. And comment below, do you think Africa's sovereignty movement will succeed, or will the West find a way to pull it back into dependency once again? Because history is unfolding, and whether the world admits it or not, Africa is no longer waiting.